So, with the current state of the GPU market essentially being a disaster, I headed over to Micro Center to try to find what is one of the best deals that they have for graphics cards, and in general, it is the RX 6600. This has been one of the best value GPUs that you could find pretty much for years now, and it somehow has managed to remain relevant, mostly due to the fact that the rest of the market around it has been so disastrous. And well, this model I ended up picking up from Micro Center, open boxed for $160. And well, it is an insane value, but I have not even checked to see what the condition of this is. It does have a checklist right here of what they did to make sure that it's all working. So supposedly they checked the unit posts, they cleaned any kind of dust or debris on it. It includes a power cord or adapter. Obviously that does not really apply to this because it's a graphics card. The power cord is going to be attached to your power supply, but I'm going to assume that that just means that it works, which would make sense since, you know, it's tested to post. Wi-Fi antenna does not apply to this at all, neither does getting data wiped or keyboard, but in general, supposedly for the stuff that the typical graphics card would have, it has all been checked. Now, in general, the packaging for this model is extremely bare bones due to the fact that it is a pretty low-end model, and it is from ASRock. Alright, so we do have the plastic shroud here along with the fans, and it does have its fan grill, and this thing does seem to be pretty spotless, at least in terms of any major dust buildup. There's, you know, just a little bit of dust here and there, but it's the type of thing that you would see on anything that's been sitting anywhere for more than 5 minutes. So it's definitely a used GPU, but the condition is pretty great. Now, at $160, this is a pretty great value because the only other things that I could find even remotely within this price range at Micro Center were different models of the RX 6500 XT, the RTX 3050, and they even had some new in-box RX 580s. That's right, GPUs that released 8 years ago being sold brand new in box for about $30 less than what I paid for this. And we are, of course, going to see how this performs in the modern day with brand new titles. It is only 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and while I do say only, in terms of what is within its price category, it is kind of undisputed. You know, while a high-end RX 580 can have 8 gigabytes of RAM, there are models that have 4 gigabytes. The RTX 3050 is looking at 6 gigabytes of RAM, and the A580 from Intel is also looking at about the same amount of VRAM. So both have 8 gigabytes of RAM, but this should on paper be far more powerful than the A580, as well as pretty much most other GPUs that you'll find within this price category. Of course, as I mentioned, I did get this open box, but its full retail price at Micro Center is not that far off from this. So I didn't get some insane savings or anything like that, but it is a pretty decent level of savings, especially for the kind of performance that I'm expecting to get out of this. I personally have used an RX 6600 before for a build that I did a few years ago, roughly around the time period that this launched at, but of course it has been, at this point, I think 2 years, and I would love to revisit this thing on some modern titles. So the system that we're going to be putting this into is the system that has the Ryzen 9 7945HX, so that is a mobile CPU, but it is a 16-core, 32-thread CPU. This thing will not have any issues running on that whatsoever, and that is being paired with 96 gigabytes of RAM, so no RAM limitations there at all. The biggest bottleneck is 100% going to be the GPU. We're going to be testing it out in 1080p, but I am also going to try some titles in 1440p. But I have been really looking forward to this because the more I look at the pricing of GPUs in the current market, the more heartbroken I become. It is just a terrible time to try to get into PC gaming if you're trying to look towards the mid-range and above. But in the lower end of the market, there can be some interesting options. And well, this is one of the best values that I've been able to find so far. So let's see this thing in action. So the first game that we're going to be taking a look at is a brand new title for 2025, and that is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This is a turn-based JRPG inspired title, even though it is made by a French studio. And well, because of the style of game that this is, you don't necessarily need the highest performance possible. And well, we are running the game right now with the high graphics settings, and we are using upscaling, though the game itself doesn't seem to support FSR. Instead, the only thing I could find in the menu was XESS, but it does also support TSR, and we are using TSR upscaling, and that's at the medium quality setting, which sets a render scale of 75%. So high graphics, medium TSR upscaling. But if you notice, the GPU is at effectively 100% utilization for the memory, and that's going to be the case the entirety of the time. And what this really translates to in the game itself is not exactly incredible performance, and also visually speaking, everything looks kind of fuzzy and off. There's a lot of issues with the textures of everything, and of course the fact that we have to use TSR upscaling means that visually speaking everything doesn't look all that remarkable, and we aren't hitting a 60 FPS average. Though, as I said, with a title like this level of performance is a lot more forgiving. It's just not the most ideal visually. It's especially jarring because of the fact that the game relies heavily on these beautiful pre-rendered cutscenes, and when you go from that to these very fuzzy, almost potato-ish quality graphics, it can make things a little rough to experience. Now, the next title that I took a look at is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, though admittedly I didn't get very far into this one. This CryEngine powered game ended up really impressing me with the level of performance that I was getting for running at the high graphics settings, and visually speaking, it does look pretty great. Of course, we are pretty much almost maxing out our memory utilization. Of course, we are pretty much maxing out our VRAM, but that doesn't seem to be causing us any issues here. And it really seems like this is the kind of title where you're going to get some pretty remarkable performance throughout a lot of it, but I need to get deeper into the game. But it is one of those titles where I'm kind of really interested in playing it, and I haven't even gotten through the first one yet. Sniper Elite Resistance was another one of those titles that released this year that really impressed me with the level of performance that you can get out of it. This is the game itself running at the highest in-game graphics settings, so we are at Ultra, and that is at a 1080p resolution, no upscaling whatsoever, and the performance is remarkable. Both the FPS average and 1% lows are in the most ideal territory, and the frame time chart is really just absolutely spectacular. In general, this is a franchise that runs really well on most systems, and I'm glad to see that this new title completely carries over on that, though it does seem like they didn't really change much at all in comparison to the previous title, but I don't say that as a bad thing. I did also play some Marvel Rivals, though technically it isn't a title that released in 2025. It might as well have been, since it released in December of last year. That means the vast majority of the playtime that people have in this title has been in 2025. And though visually speaking, it's not exactly a graphically intense looking title, it's surprisingly heavy to run. And here at the medium graphics settings, using FSR upscaling at quality with no frame generation at all, we're getting 1% lows and an FPS average that are surprisingly low. At these graphics settings, you can see that there isn't a complete utilization of all our VRAM. There does seem to be at least a little bit of headroom there, but being an Unreal 5 title, it does seem to be pretty heavy on a GPU that at this point is a couple of years out of date. You're certainly going to be able to get away with playing the title, but you might consider dropping things down to low, and even then, you really shouldn't expect a high refresh rate gaming experience out of this, which is a little disappointing to see out of a title that's essentially within the esports realm. Of course, I feel like it's not fair if I don't include R.E.P.O in this comparison. Of course, I think it's not fair if I don't include R.E.P.O in these tests. this is one of the biggest game releases on Steam in 2025. It has more relevancy really than any of the other titles that I've taken a look at so far. This is what the vast majority of people are going to be playing in comparison to those titles. And well, in this specific title, we're getting hundreds of frames per second, and this is at the 1440p native resolution of my display. So I'm not even running this at 1080p, this is at 1440p. And of course, it's because R.E.P.O really does run at a very low internal resolution, and you do get this really great levels of performance, and it all fits into the aesthetic of the game. And I think it's important to include this because, especially as we're seeing the rise of indie games, titles like this are going to become far more relevant than a lot of these big budget, very demanding AAA titles, because this is realistically what people are playing. As of right now, this is the 5th most played game on Steam, and you are going to be able to get some incredible performance out of it in a $160 graphics card. And the last title that I took a look at is Elder Scrolls for Oblivion, of course, that being the new remaster that just suddenly dropped. This is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and while the game itself does support upscaling, there is no upscaling enabled here, and that was just because for some reason in the menu it would not let me enable upscaling at all. I don't really know what the issue was there. I don't know if that is a current ongoing bug, but no matter how many times I restarted the game or anything, it just would not let me enable it. So this is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using the entirety of our VRAM here. It is pretty much at full utilization, and I think that might be what's causing the issues here, because the game will perform pretty fine. It's not going to be remarkable, but it'll be at least consistent until you get into a new area when new things need to be loaded in, and that really drags down those 1% lows because of the stutter that ends up happening. And it can make the experience of just walking around and exploring the world pretty annoying. But if you had to choose between not playing this game and playing like this, I think a lot of people that own this graphics card would realistically put up with this, because a lot of us played Skyrim in conditions that were like this or worse. Hell, if it was even like that with the original Oblivion, if you ever played it on console or just did not have a good PC. So after all that testing, what are the results that we see here? Well, it did surprisingly well in a decent amount of titles. You know, obviously there are titles like R.E.P.O and like Marvel Rivals, which will have an easier time running on here, though Marvel Rivals was still one of the heavier titles that we tried to run on here. It still did decently well. It's really just those big, heavy AAA titles, usually the single player titles, that end up being a problem. You know, Elder Scrolls was one of the ones that gave me the biggest amount of issues, and overall I would just say it wasn't really a playable experience. But still, decent results overall, considering the fact that we are talking about some pretty heavy titles. But that doesn't really paint the whole story here. So what I want to do next is, for the next video, I am going to take a look at this graphics card with the 25 most popular games on Steam today, because I think that is a better indication more than anything else on how relevant this thing is to gamers today. It's going to be in the titles that are the most important to people today. So stay tuned for that. That should be going up tomorrow. And after that, we might have a full general conclusion on this graphics card. So stay tuned for that. But this was just a quick look at this graphics card with some of the newest titles today, and a surprising amount of them performed really well on here. Some of the highlights, of course, being Sniper Elite and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. But I'll catch you guys in the next one tomorrow.